Thank you very much for taking the time to watch this video. My name's Jason Neff. I'm at the University of Colorado Boulder, and today I'll be talking about how we have been approaching regional mapping of land capability to support land planning, and how we are approaching localization of information through the use of the LandPKS mobile application. This presentation is part of the Digital Farming Systems Consortium, and the purpose of this presentation is really to start a dialogue with all of you about whether these sorts of techniques or different types of related techniques might be useful in addressing some of the questions you may have in your area of interest. Thank you again for joining. Before we get started on this talk about land planning, I want to just introduce the other members of the Digital Farming Systems Consortium team that are shown here. There will be other videos like this likely coming in the future, so you can learn more about what these other folks are doing. If you wouldn't mind, it would be excellent if you could point your phone at this QR code on the right side of the screen and take a very, very brief webinar survey. This helps us track who is watching the video and also helps us improve this method of information delivery as we move forward. As you may know, the Digital Farming Systems Consortium has a number of different elements, including crop modeling, livestock modeling, looking at productivity under current and future climates, examining human nutrition and social components, as well as issues and work related to adaptation. In this talk, we'll talk about the land allocation and optimization component of the project, but as I noted just a moment ago, there also will be future presentations focusing on these other elements. So here I would like to talk a little bit about some of the dimensions that go into land planning. So land planning, of course, requires knowledge of physical conditions such as soil, slope, climate, and so on, and that's what I'll talk about today. But I do also want to acknowledge that land planning is heavily influenced by socioeconomic factors. I won't talk about those today, but clearly that's a critical consideration in thinking about how to use lands effectively and sustainably. From the biophysical perspective, land planning has been very challenging, in part because of limited or inaccurate geospatial data. So I'm going to walk through two examples. The first will be a regional analysis done in Niger, where we looked at regional data and soil maps and used those to characterize the land potential of a region. And then the second part will be how we can dial down to the field scale using the LandPKS mobile application. So I'll walk through both of these two examples in the next few slides. The first example I'm going to give is mapping land capability classification for this part of Niger called the Dossa region. It's the southwestern portion of Niger near the Nigerian border. This is a target area for the development of improved agriculture in a relatively unstable and high-risk area of the world for drought and other food insecurity issues. The land planning framework that we used for this region is called the Land Capability Classification. This is a relatively old assessment classification developed first by the U.S. Department of Agriculture and used extensively in different parts of the world, that does a sort of first order analysis of whether or not land is well suited to the support of agriculture. So briefly before we jump into some of these numbers, the LCC works basically by classifying the landscape into different categories. Class 1 would be your best suited piece of land for agriculture, basically well-suited agriculture with relatively few limitations to crop growth. We go to level 2 or class 2. That is also suitable to agriculture, but there are moderate limitations that may restrict crop selection or require specific management practices. As we get into 3 or 4, we start to see severe limitations that really restrict the practice of agriculture. And once we're into the class 5 through 8, we need to start talking about rangeal into use or set-asides of areas, because those areas simply are not suitable to crop cultivation over the long term. The way that LCC works is actually by looking at different types of erosion, different types of limitation, including erosion, a number of soil-based factors such as soil depth, texture, salinity, stoniness, so water storage capacity, and lime requirements. All of those can limit agricultural activity. It also looks at wetness, including flooding, water table depth, and permeability. And the system goes through a sequential series of steps, basically, to identify the most limiting characteristic on the environment in a particular location, and to rank that then into one of the classes. So a site might be class 3 because it has high salinity, and we can use the LCC actually to address things. So if we said we address salinity, then maybe the secondary limitation takes it to a class 2, where the limitation is really around surface soil textural characteristics. So I'll give some illustrations of this in a moment, but that's the basic way that the LCC classification scheme works. One of our goals in looking at this area was to evaluate what geospatial data could be used to create an LCC geospatial map for this region at relatively high resolution, 250 meter grid resolution. So to do that, we use a number of different data sets, including the ESA Sentinel digital elevation model, which has a 12.5 meter resolution that we upscaled to 250 meters. And then we used two digital soils products, the ISRIC Soil Grids product, which has a grid of 250 meters, and the FAO HWSD soil database, which has a 1 kilometer grid. We had access to about 1,300 data points through this area that were collected by the International Fertilizer Development Center that included texture and other attributes that we could use to compare our results from the geospatial data against field data. And I'll show you the differences and the similarities that we found between these data sets in the next slides. To provide a little more context, this is what the FAO HWSD data look like for Niger. Now, the FAO HWSD is a globally gridded data set. It has about a 1 kilometer resolution. It has a topsoil unit of 0 to 30 centimeters and a subsoil unit of 30 to 100. It's made up of many different soil mapping units, and each soil map unit has a dominant as well as multiple subdominant soils. So the trick with this particular product in trying to do anything like LCC is that we don't know at any particular point on the landscape whether we are actually in the dominant soil for the polygon or whether we're in a subdominant soil. In this study, we use the dominant soils for our soil attributes that we use to calculate LCC, and we'll show you the comparison with the other products in a moment. This database is really widely used. It's typically not as high resolution or as accurate as a local database, but it provides a good baseline for a well-accepted global database of soils for comparison to the other inputs that we have here. The other gridded soils product that we used is the ISRIC Soil Grids product. This one is developed in a very different way from the FAO Soil Grids or FAO HWSD product. This is also globally gridded, has 250 meter resolution. It's based on a machine learning framework that is trained on soil profiles from unique sites that are distributed across the globe. Now, the one thing to note about ISRIC's product for Niger is that there are very few observations in this part of the world, and by virtue of the particular way that this model is built, the data would not be expected to be very complete, and therefore the mapping would not be likely as accurate as it might be in a place where there are more data points. The upside of this particular product is it is a much more vertically separated set of horizons, 0, 5, 15, 30, 60, 100, and 200 centimeters. And so from these data, we took out the input data that we needed to calculate LCC, including texture, depth, and other things. So as I noted, we were fortunate in Niger to have access to a fairly extensive field data set. This was 1,306 sites that were collected across the region. These were only surface soils, so only 20 centimeters, but they had texture, chemistry, soil organic matter, and other attributes that we were able to use to generate a field-based LCC calculation. To do that, we had to Krieg these data, create a grid, and then overlay that grid with the one that we have for soil grids and for HWSD so that we could make a comparison between the different products. As I noted before, these data were collected by the International Fertilizer Development Center in collaboration with a number of scientists in Niger. So to give you a sense of what the data input differences look like between these different products, it's quite notable when you look at the different inputs across these, the digital soil maps versus the field data. So the interpolated field data sand content is on the left. So this would be the Krieged data from actual field observations. The data that emerges out of the dominant soil type from HWSD is shown in the center image, and the data that is built from a machine learning framework in the soil grids context is shown on the right. Now I'm showing you sand because of course texture is a key control, especially in a semi-arid region, on things like water holding capacity and hydrologic responses in soils, and therefore has a very large impact on the potential for agriculture. So one of the first things we see here is the challenge in using some of our geospatial data products in settings like this, because we do see quite large differences in estimates across the different products. So before I show you the results of the LCC calculations, I want to say a little bit more about the algorithm that we use in this calculation. So land capability classification can be estimated in a variety of different ways. We base our estimates on the analyses or the algorithms that are incorporated within the Land Potential Knowledge System mobile application. I'll describe that more at the end of this presentation. But those data that we take into the LCC calculation are passed forward in a series of steps. Now, typically LCC also includes climate. We did not include climate constraints on agriculture here because this area already is a strongly semi-arid or arid environment where climate plays a dominant role, and so we wanted to look at the physical limitations. So basically what happens in the calculations is that we pass in values for slope, depth, texture, water storage capacity, which is a derived variable, flooding, water table depth, permeability, salinity, and lime requirements. Those move forward. Just backing up, lime requirements are actually calculated from pH, and salinity is based on parameters that are available in our input data sets. For each one of those variables, we calculate a land capability classification. So the land capability classification on a very steep slope would be a higher number, meaning less suitable to agriculture. And if that ends up being the most constraining variable out of all of these calculations, then it becomes the constraint on agriculture. So just to say that in a different way, if the LCC based on slope gives us a class 4, which is a highly restricted site for agriculture, and the LCC for soil depth gives us a class 2, which is a less restricted category for agriculture, then the final LCC will take the highest number, the LCC 4, class 4, based on the very steep slope and the limitations that emerge out of that. So our final data product is actually a series of ranked limitations. So the LCC rating with the most severe limitation, and then the LCC rating with the next most severe limitation, and so on down. And the nice aspect of that is that we can look at different limitations. So for example, if the most severe limitation is flooding, and flooding can be prevented by a certain intervention, then we can remove that one and look at the next most severe limitation and the class category rating that would then be applicable for any land planning activities. So with all of those input data, these are actually the results then that we see spatially gridded across the region using our 3 input data sets, with field data on the left, FAO HWSD input data in the middle, and the soil grids input data on the far right. In all of these calculations, the region is heavily limited for agriculture. It's mostly class 4, which means very severe limitations with limited cropping options. And the primary limitation that is driving this is a water holding capacity of the soils. And in fact, across all of these products, we see over 90% of the area limited by this water holding capacity. In effect, the textural and depth components of the soil are such that the limited capacity to hold water is appearing as the primary constraint on agriculture in the region, with secondary or other constraints making up a very small amount of the total classification here. This is notable because despite the very large differences in these three products and the field, including the field data, we see a fairly similar overall conclusion based on this analysis. However, we do see relatively large spatial variation in the estimates based on the product, and that's important if we're actually moving into a land planning exercise. So as I mentioned a moment ago, LCC is an interesting system because you can systematically remove a limitation and move down the list of the subsequent limitations. So because our primary limitation in this region is available water holding capacity in the soil, we can remove that limitation and see what sits underneath that and see what happens to the actual overall rating of the region for agriculture. Now, in effect or in practice, the removal of the AWC limitation really is representing the introduction of something like an irrigation scheme that has irrigation timing that is sufficient to address any of the water holding capacity limitations from soils. And that is, in fact, a management intervention that is being considered for some portions of this region. So if we remove that primary limitation of available water holding capacity or content in soils, we see what are the secondary limitations and what would then be the rating of the region. And if we look at the HWSD map product based assessment on the far left, we see the region is mostly an LCC class of 3, which is still pretty severely limited for agriculture, and actually is limited largely by stoniness and other physical factors. If we look at soil grids, we see a very different spatial patterning, where some of the region has a class 2 rating, which is a reasonably good rating for agriculture, but has some different limitations, again, mostly physically based. The big distinction we saw with the field data here were the map that is shown on the right, which is a bit of a mix between the soil grids and the HWSD estimates, but most notably highlights the issues around soil pH and the need for a lime requirement in treatment. So while the rating systems are one level, the limitations are the second level, because this helps explore what are the most important interventions that would need to be deployed to support agriculture in the region. And in this particular case study, we see a very different outcome from the field data than we do from the geospatial products. Again, I just want to reemphasize that this part of the world is a very difficult place for a product like soil grids or even for the FAO product to estimate soils. And if you have a digital soils product that is more well developed, or a national scale soils map, we might expect much better outcomes from the geospatial product when we're making estimates about LCC or the primary or secondary limitations. I want to make just one more point on this Niger case study, because one of the very nice aspects of this type of approach is that we do develop a geospatial product that has some very practical implications. So this map right here is an estimate of the soil water storage capacity that is developed out of the field data that we had access to in the region. And these numbers here have real meaning in terms of predicting what types of crops might be most appropriate for this setting, and also what risk particular locations within this region might face during a drought. This also helps us identify ways that we might intervene in these systems to, in this case, address limitations that are associated with soil water storage capacity. Those could include things such as organic amendments, including manure and crop residues, use of drought-tolerant crops, different types of management techniques, or irrigation, as I mentioned before. So this activity is not intended to be a definitive final solution to an area, but it is a nice entry point into a conversation about what the primary limitations are and how you might address those limitations through a series of strategic and systematic interventions in agriculture to support systems that would otherwise be very limited. So for the rest of this talk, I want to now transition to talking about how we localize to the field scale and how we can combine mobile application-based approaches with some of these geospatial approaches. One of the core issues with geospatial data is that there will be limitations in scale or scope or accuracy of data. And we know this when we look at pictures like this, where there's a large amount of topographic variability on a site. We're not going to see this in most of the soils maps, and we might make very different decisions or recommend different practices for different locations on the site. So in order to get to the point where you can actually make these recommendations, you need a second step beyond the geospatial to actually localize the information. And that's what I want to talk about here. So for the rest of this talk, I want to now transition to talking about how we localize to the field scale and how we can combine mobile application-based approaches with some of these geospatial approaches. One of the core issues with geospatial data is that there will be limitations in scale or scope or accuracy of data. And we know this when we look at pictures like this, where there's a large amount of topographic variability on a site. We're not going to see this in most of the soils maps, and we might make very different decisions or recommend different practices for different locations on the site. So in order to get to the point where you can actually make these recommendations, you need a second step beyond the geospatial to actually localize the information. And that's what I want to talk about here. As I noted just a moment ago, we can provide more training on how this application actually works. But what I want to do is show you 3 examples of why this type of localization can be very important in making decisions. This example is looking at soil nutrient and physical properties for dryland rice suitability in Ghana. And the idea here is to look at the recommendation that would be made based on a soil map alone versus a recommendation that would be made with the application of the LandPKS application at the site. So if we look at the FAO AEZ Soil Quality Index, which is shown in the left in the table here, you can see the legend for this table just immediately left of it. The first set of columns show you the estimates from the soil map alone of the issues that you might be facing on the site, and the right set of values show you the issues that you would be facing once you've actually narrowed down the localization of the soil using the mobile app. And while we can't get into the details here about what this means, what you can see is that you end up with a different potential set of issues, and therefore a different potential set of interventions or solutions that would be deployed on this site now that you have localized using this mobile application. And what I also want to emphasize here is that this can be done in the field in 20 to 30 minutes without the need for laboratory measurements. It doesn't completely certainly doesn't replace the full value of laboratory measurements, but it provides an avenue for this type of assessment in locations where it just is not feasible to be measuring soil chemistry and physical properties at a high frequency in space and time. The second example I want to show you is from a field in Tanzania, and this is an estimate of available water holding capacity that is actually determined using the app and the texture and soil depth assessments that are done in the field. Now, these areas would have mapped as a single soil type using one of the existing global scale soils maps. But as you can see, the available water holding capacity here shown in centimeters is very different as you move from forest to the upper field to the lower field. and therefore the decisions on what crops are planted and how they are managed across this actual field scale would be different because of the observation that you can make with a mobile app in the field. So this is an example here of how you can approach soil hydrologic and climatic management, and even how you might assess drought resilience or risk differently when you had this field scale information emerging out of the mobile application assessment done at the field level. The last example I'll give is a brief one, which jumps off from the explanation I gave earlier about Niger. The mobile app, LandPKS, actually will estimate the land capability classification based on the determinations that are made at the field scale. So just as we talked about the different types of class ratings and limitations that emerge from the geospatial analysis in Niger, the mobile app will do a similar set of calculations and tell you what type of class you're in terms of suitability to agriculture and what the core limitations are. And as you can see in the screenshot here, you actually have the opportunity in the app to turn different limitations off and on, just as I did in the Niger example at a larger scale. And this allows someone at a field to actually experiment with what would happen in terms of the suitability of the land to agriculture with different types of limitations being addressed through management or other interventions. So this is a very powerful tool to, again, localize information down to the point where a farmer is making a decision. If you did not get a chance to take the very short webinar survey at the beginning of this talk, here's another opportunity to do so. Just pause the video, take a picture of this QR code with your phone, and there's a very short Google survey that you can fill out that will help us understand how to improve these types of presentations as we move forward. Thank you very much for watching this video. We will be happy to provide more information in a Q&A session or more information for training if you're interested. In the meantime, if you would like to look more closely at the LandPKS mobile application, you can download this for free on the App Store or on Google Play. Just search for LandPKS and you can explore some of the things we talked about today. Thanks again, and we'll look forward to discussing these possible research directions with you in the future.